Hello everyone, welcome back to the YouTube channel. My name is Mike and we're continuing having a look at historical videos on YouTube. So today we're continuing with potential histories Germany could not win the Second World War part 2 video. Now I apologise for the delay as well from me not uploading. For the last 2 weeks, or near enough 2 weeks, the internet has actually been down in my area, so I haven't been able to do anything. So apologies for that, but I'm back. I'm hoping to continue with 3 videos a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Hopefully, providing the internet doesn't collapse again, or electricity or society as we know it collapses, should hopefully stick with that. So without further ado, let's get into this. I really enjoyed the first part of this video, the why Germany couldn't win part 1. I thought it was entertaining as well as informative, and again I'll be trying to do the same things here when they present their heading of their reason why Germany couldn't win. I'll try and talk about my personal opinions on that, then we'll watch the video play out and I'll try and fill in any gaps or elaborate on any things where I can. So without further ado, let's get into this, shall we? Okay, some like old school Medal of Honor, yeah.
Excellent work with the German Miss, Powell. Here's to hoping better sources will be used in the future. However, our intel has picked up reports of continued resistance in the comment sections. Mentions of Dunkirk and who not to invade seem widespread. We will be dropping you directly into the comment section, with your primary objective being to root out these myths. Be cautious, though. Reports indicate that the Wereboos will be armed with Cold War-era memoirs and David Irving books. Godspeed, Lieutenant.
Oh, okay, that's actually... Okay, yeah, he's actually typed that himself. So I'll just pause that there in case any of you want to watch that. As usual as well, the video to this, or the link to this video will be in the description should you want to go and check that out, which I very much advise that you do. Give them a like, give them a subscribe. They're the ones who make this great content anyway. But yeah, so I'll go back and read that in my own time. Won't hold that up to you guys too much.
This video is brought to you by Dashlane. Stay secure online and never forget a password again. More on that later. So you may recall around 6 months ago, I made a video about how due to Germany's lacking in the population, industrial, and raw materials sectors, they could not have pulled out a victory in the war they started in 1939. And it sorta got out of hand.
I think we should read the comments.
The other day, as I was reading the comment section there, I found that, along with some people agreeing with me, there were a lot of dissenting opinions of yet more ways that people thought the final victory could be achieved. And I am here today to respond to them, and also probably clear up what I meant at the end of the last video talking about limited use of alternative history. Here are a few more ways Germany could not have won World War II.
Okay, so in the first part of this reaction video to part 1 of this is the one thing that I said. With alternate history, it's always dangerous, it's always dodgy, but if there was ever going to be a case where, in my personal opinion, I believe that Second World War could have changed, is Dunkirk, or the BEF, because there is an argument to be made that had the BEF been killed at Dunkirk, then Churchill may not be the one that succeeds Chamberlain. It might well be Lord Halifax, who was more pro-appeasement, pro kind of trying to avoid a further conflict or war with Nazi Germany. And I think, you know, to a certain extent, you know, the BEF, over 300,000, if you kill 300,000 British on the beaches of Dunkirk after basically France has already fallen, there's an argument to be made there that public opinion might turn away from, you know, continuing this war and more to one that would bring an end to it, especially with the memories of the First World War. However, again, that's a huge, massive standalone. And again, from what we know, public opinion was not favourable to Nazi Germany at all, or fascism. You know, within the UK itself as well, you had things like the Battle of Cable Street. You had various minor skirmishes, particularly in London as well, the East End of London particularly, where the British Union of Fascists would march down and into like a minority or foreign neighbourhoods, or Jewish neighbourhoods as it were, in the East End more so, and then try and rally support basically, or terrorise, kind of the Jewish population there, and it resulted in basically these English East End dockers who weren't Jewish themselves banding together and fighting off the fascists themselves. So there wasn't an appetite for fascism within the UK. And again, if you say about losing the BEF, don't get me wrong, would have been a massive hit. However, you know, it's very difficult to say that that would be a killing force, because one, you have the Americans. You know, if you talk about just pure losing the British, like the BEF, those forces either killed or captured, as long as Britain stays in the war, then Britain still has the Commonwealth, they still have the Americans who can fill in the gaps, basically, of those lost men. The thing for me is much more on a political stance, and I think that's a lot more grey. That could potentially knock the UK out of the war, you know, by putting a pro-appeasement in to stop the violence, so to speak. They don't want another repeat of the First World War where generations were lost type thing. So I think that's a legitimate argument. Again, it's difficult to know what way, but yeah, and I just got to say this now as well. I imagine this video probably will say it as well, but contrary to popular belief, the British at Dunkirk weren't allowed to escape. You know, neither Hitler or Goering or any of those allowed the British to escape. You know, the Dunkirk themselves was raided by the Luftwaffe for practically the entire duration, you know, sinking loads of ships, thousands of men were killed, and the only reason that Panthers and stuff like that weren't rolling onto the beach was because of the French rearguard, who'd done an extremely admirable job, as well as the British rearguard units as well, who stayed behind with the French. You know, so Germans weren't just going to let us, well, I say us, weren't allowed to let, like, the kind of British Commonwealth and what French forces were able to escape out of the goodness of his heart. But let's see, because I think in terms of casualties lost, like if the British were killed, as this says, then very much yes. I think that Germany, that wouldn't have a large impact because you'd still have the Americans. However, I think on a political scale, there's a bit more leeway either way of potentially Lord Halifax coming in and potentially a deal being made. But we'll see what potential history has to say.
One thing I have seen brought up a few times is that if Hitler had not let the British Expeditionary Force get away at Dunkirk, that later the troops could not be used during Operation Overlord and thus no Western Front, with the implication that the German troops could have been sent east to stop the Soviets. This, however, has two problems. Firstly, the BEF was not simply allowed to leave France, as this narrative suggests. In Mein Kampf, Hitler does speak highly of the British at times and suggests that they could be a potential ally, but this is clearly without a strong grasp of British culture and political policy, and was always discussed with Germany being above Britain and having them be administrators of the Reich, but only if they could shake their, quote, Jewish influence. Furthermore, he realized that Britain was against his intentions in the East and would become a barrier there. All this being said, by the time of the invasion of France, Britain was definitely an enemy, and Hitler was doing them no favors. So then why Dunkirk? Well, this was an operational failing, not a peaceful gesture. On May 15th, 1940, the Germans broke through the French 2nd and 9th armies and steamed ahead night and day, thanks in part to some tablet boys, towards the coast. Although these gains were good for the Germans, the mechanized forces were quickly running out of supplies and were leaving their flanks exposed, which opened them to being cut off, the result of which could cause ruin for the German plans. It is at this point a nervous Hitler, being counseled by Generals von Kluge and von Rundstedt, gave a halt order to secure the flanks and allow the exhausted panzer divisions to refit. Check out this video by Mark Gurges for more. Upon the halt, our favorite drug-addled flyboy Goering promised the Luftwaffe could destroy the British at Dunkirk, and although he failed, I would hardly call the actions of the Luftwaffe just letting the British go. With thousands being killed, over 200 ships being sunk, over 100 planes shot down, and the loss of all the BEF's equipment, Hitler even realized that the halt was an error and resumed the attack while the evacuation was underway, and it was only successful due to the brave French soldiers that held out until it was complete. But even if he had let them go, there are still more problems asserting that this means a German victory in the war. Britain had to rearm all the soldiers evacuated, which is a huge loss and took some time. This force, when returned to England, was not in any way ready to turn around and invade France, although the troop reserves were good to have if Germany decided to invade. But they were not in fighting condition for a long time. But most importantly, Britain is not the only nation nation present at D-Day, a combined landing force of American, British, and Canadian forces, along with smaller groups from other countries, landed and fought on the Western Front. Although the troop loss of Dunkirk had failed may have limited Britain's number of troops, the United States, having only mobilized about 9% of its population in the course of the war, could have very realistically filled in the gaps as it did in reality with the British equipment losses. But all of this still doesn't take into account where the real war is being fought, in the east.
Yeah.
The German army will be decidedly on its back foot after Kursk, and the Soviets have massive offensives planned in 1944 regardless of what the Western Allies do. Would the defeat of Germany have taken longer without the Western Front opening? Of course it would. But by 1944, the Soviets have a decisive upper hand and will push the Germans back to Berlin. So to say the war could have been shifted if the British had 300,000 fewer troops ignores the reality of what the Germans were truly up against by 1944.
Okay, I think that last part is certainly holds a lot of weight. It was the war in the East which ultimately was curtains for the Germans. However, again, I would have liked perhaps him to tackle the kind of political aspect again, like not just the fact of losing material or men, as it were, but the idea of the psychological impact or the political impact that might have, rather than Churchill, Lord Halifax type thing, and perhaps that might sway public opinion to a more appeasement deadline kind of ideal. However, at the same vein of that, it's almost impossible to know, because again, similar to what I said at the end of the first video, the problem with alternate history is you just keep building misconceptions on suggestions of things or fictional characters that didn't happen and stuff like that. So again, in our time, or say metaphorically, the BEF were killed at Dunkirk. Yes, they could very much, as they said, appoint a pro-appeasement kind of replacement for Chamberlain who makes peace with Germany, etc., etc. All roses for Hitler. However, in the same vein, similar to what the Blitz done and galvanised public opinion against Adolf even more, the loss of the BF could provide that exact same driving force and just inspire the British to fight even harder than they did. I think there's certainly something to be made about the loss of aircraft over the Battle of Britain. Obviously, if Britain isn't involved in the war, then Germany doesn't suffer the losses that it done in North Africa with the Afrika Korps. It doesn't suffer the losses of aircraft over the Battle of Britain and experienced pilots, more to the point. However, would that have been enough in a War of the East? Personally, I doubt. Anyway, so even, I think, theoretically, had Britain even had a peace deal necessarily, I'm not sure that necessarily would have been enough for a war against the Soviets. And again, that's siding with if Britain then sued for peace after losing the BEF, not that they come back. I mean, if Britain loses the BEF and still remains in the war, then there's still no way that Germany can cross the channel. So it would just come back, I think I remember hearing somebody that referred to the United Kingdom as the unsinkable aircraft carrier for the Allies, basically, to springboard back in anyway. So as long as Britain's in a fight, the war is still very much on, because there's no way Germany could cross the channel. And if Britain even isn't in the fight, I still think, yes, Germany isn't losing those planes and those tanks in North Africa or the Battle of Britain, but they would still probably lose them in a far more drawn-out fight against the Soviets than it did in our timeline. But I still think Germany ultimately would, well, they played their hands badly, and I think ultimately, regardless of attacking the Soviets, or regardless of sinking the BEF or not, then German days were numbered. Do not declare war on insert superpower. Well, I mean, that's very vague, isn't it? Obviously it's a legitimate thing, but then at that point it's no longer the Second World War. If Germany does not declare war on, well, the only two superpowers that it doesn't declare war on is, or it could not declare war on rather, is the Soviet Union and the United States of America. Because by attacking Poland, Britain and France were involved. They both promised to protect Poland, and although they kind of done it half-heartedly, they were still in the war from the point of the invasion of Poland. So in order to not go to war with Britain or France, Germany has to not attack Poland, which means World War II doesn't happen. If Germany doesn't attack the Soviet Union, then the Germans are no longer Nazis because Hitler was always going to strike eastwards. You know, Mein Kampf is littered with it. The destruction of Bolshevikism, communism, the Lebensraum. He was always going to expand eastwards. So in order to make Hitler not declare war on the Soviet Union, makes Hitler not Hitler. So that's one failure, and that's a bit like what I said in the first part of this video. And not declaring war on the United States, I mean, yes, but at the same vein, you know, providing that Britain is still in the war, Britain was still going at trying to drive American public support for the war against Nazi Germany. And so there's no saying that just because Hitler didn't declare war on the USA, there's no saying that the USA wouldn't just join with Britain and declare war on Germany itself. You know, so I don't think either way, unless you dramatically alter what the Second World War is or who Hitler was, then this argument doesn't kind of hold anything. And I'm curious to see what potential history adds to that. We'll play. There we go.
This is another one I saw a lot. Just don't invade the Soviet Union, or just don't declare war on the United States. And although these comments are puzzling on the surface, as removing a major combatant redefines what the war is and you are now describing how to win a smaller conflict, there are reasons this doesn't work that are all to do with character motivation and why these things were going to happen unless you fundamentally change who the Germans and Hitler were, and then stray into fiction. Let's first start with the Soviet Union. If you read Mein Kampf, don't do it, it's not a very good book, or listen to a lot of Hitler's speeches, both in public and in private, he fixates on this idea of Judeo-Bolshevism, which is a rather outdated term that grew out of the idea of a Jewish conspiracy that had created communism, and the two were the biggest evils facing the Aryan nation. There's a whole rabbit hole to go down here with multiple theorists and their ideas, but I'm not going to go into it here. But that's the basic idea, and Hitler subscribed to it. And the result of this is Hitler's main goal being to destroy the Soviet Union and become the savior of the Aryan people in his eyes, and in the process, wiping out millions of subhuman Slavs and resettle the land with Germans. Hitler saw this as his destiny, meaning he was going to do it at some point, and that this fictitious Hitler that would win World War II by not invading the East is just that, fiction. He ceases becoming the Hitler that we know and that existed, and now we're talking about a made-up story. Now, as to why the Soviet Union was invaded when it was, comes down to two things: resources and, frankly, paranoia. Germany, as I outlined in my previous video on this, spent a lot of the war with fairly limited oil resources and knew that it couldn't support this attack any later than June of '41 with all the fuel that the battle over Britain was consuming. And even the trade with the Soviet Union would not make up for this deficit. So the High Command felt they had to go in when they did before the army would not be able to move as they needed to finish the campaign by September, the time in which the High Command figured the Soviet Union would collapse in on itself under the weight of the German attack. And I'll point you to David Stahill again for more information on that. The other aspect was, as I said, paranoia. I've often seen this assertion stated in a different way of don't break the alliance with the Soviet Union, although I wouldn't even frame the German-Soviet non-aggression pact as an alliance in the way you think of with the Axis and Allies. The treaty was
it was a treaty of convenience, essentially. So the Soviet Union wanted parts of Poland, Germany wanted parts of Poland, and more than anything, the Soviet Union also wanted time to prepare for the upcoming war with Nazi Germany, because essentially Stalinist communism and Hitler's fascism were ideologically opposed in practically every facet that they possibly could be. And so a war between the two, is my personal opinion, was inevitable. There's no saying, similar to what I said earlier with the United States not getting involved by Germany declaring war on them, but rather the United States getting involved by themselves declaring war on Germany. There's no saying the same wouldn't happen with the Soviet Union, and that if Hitler just simply held off on declaring war on the Soviets, there's no saying that the Soviets wouldn't have been the ones to then break the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and that non-aggression as part of that, and then attack the Germans themselves, be the aggressors in that. There's no saying that that wouldn't have happened anyway. So again, to ignore either of those things, you're not talking about the Second World War anymore. You're talking about a completely different conflict with completely different people.
much more in the vein of, you don't get in our way, we won't get in your way, let's trade some stuff. And it was very uneasy at many points before and during its existence, becoming most volatile during combat between German and Soviet soldiers during the Poland campaign, after the Germans overran the territory that was designated as theirs and moved into territory promised to the Soviets that actually contained oil fields, making it not very subtle what the Germans were trying to do. Both Stalin and Hitler knew that some form of war was coming, just not when and who would start it, but going out of their way for the most part to not provoke it. And they didn't trust each other whatsoever. Now, I'm not implying any kind of Suvorov preventative war type thing. The Soviet Union was refitting and probably wouldn't be ready for a large war until at least mid-1942, but with these two ideologically opposing powers taking territory so quickly right next to each other, it was something that was bound to happen as soon as one of them felt they were in a position to make the first move. By 1941, the Germans felt they were, and they took the opportunity. For more on this, and the German-Soviet clashings in Poland, I'll point you towards Stephen Kotkin's second book in his Stalin series, or this video of him talking about it. The declaration of war on the US is a bit more tricky, especially given that Hitler was aware of the industrial capacity of the nation. However, he saw the US as very internally focused, and figured that it would take them much longer to mobilize than it did. Hitler always planned for war with the United States, as outlined in his second book, written but not published, in 1928, but wanted to put it off until he was ready, often skipping on details about how it would be done. He began to assume that, due to some anti-German sentiments from Roosevelt, the Americans would declare war in 1942, coming to the aid of the Allies like they did in World War I. Piggybacking off the previous statements about the Soviets, he figured he could end the war in the East and turn and fight the West. This feeling ended, though, as the Soviet campaign continued to drag on and 1942 loomed. The German Navy had been asking for war with the United States for some time, as Hitler had been holding them back to not provoke them, knowing that going against the US Navy, the Kriegsmarine would come up lacking. Hitler's solution to this was Japan, which had a large navy that he thought could tie up the Americans until he was done in Russia, then turn westward and save his plan. He constantly reassured the Japanese that Germany would throw in with them if they expanded their territory south into US-held islands. This was among many attempts to get Germany and Japan to fight the same enemy, which also included trying to get Japan to invade the Soviet Union from the east in June. Although Japan kept Hitler in the dark as to when they were going to attack, Hitler was very pleased when they did and immediately lifted all restrictions on his navy to attack US ships, and later declared war a few days later after his foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop, said, "A great power does not allow itself to be declared war upon, it declares war on others." Now, this decision may have been flawed with the hindsight of putting too much faith in the Japanese Navy and underestimating the US's ability to fight on two fronts and mobilize so quickly, but knowing that Hitler did plan to fight the US way back in the 20s, the timing may be bad given what we know now, but it was not something that he was just not going to do, in the same way he was not going to just opt out of invading the Soviet Union.
Okay, so with that War Thunder advert. Yeah, I think to a large extent what potential history is completely right. Similar to what I said before this is, for one, it's character motivation. If you make Hitler not declare war on the Soviet Union or the United States of America, you're no longer talking about the Nazi Germany of our timeline, or you're not talking about the Adolf Hitler of our timeline. There was always going to be a war. Now, the thing with the United States as well, which is rather comical, or well, comical perhaps might be the wrong word, but the idea of winning the war in East and then turning West and beating the Allies, the UK, the Commonwealth, and the United States. However, the German Navy wasn't capable of crossing a 20-mile English Channel, from northern France to Britain, with their naval support. So I am still rather curious how they would be able to then think of themselves as being able to cross the Atlantic from then to strike at the United States, or whether they was hoping that knocking out Britain might be enough to knock out the Americans, I don't know. But they weren't even capable of knocking out Britain. And they never would have been able to have knocked out Britain, I'm very certain of that. Now, of course, yes, putting faith in the Japanese Navy, of course, is legitimate. The Japanese Navy, certainly at the outset of war, had a very strong Navy. A very capable Navy, as it was. And the strikes on Pearl Harbor and stuff like that demonstrated some of the kind of potential that the Japanese Navy could do. But the thing is as well, once the Japanese Navy gets involved with the Second World War, not only as well, remember, they're not only fighting the Americans, although the Americans done the majority of fighting in the Pacific in terms of naval theatre, but the Royal Navy is still a thing. And so theoretically, even still, Japan was expected to be both a continent because that is essentially what the United States is. The United States land mass and resources is essentially a continent on its own in terms of production. So Hitler was relying on the Japanese Navy to be able to master the United States Navy, as well as the Pacific fleets of the Royal Navy and the Commonwealth nations as well. And then, after all of that, be able to then strike at the United States, presumably? Yeah, again, I must mention as well, though, when he does mention about striking at the United States in Adolf Hitler's book, he is extremely vague. It is that they will somehow win against the United States. They would somehow beat them. It doesn't exactly go into details of how, and I think that's evident the more that you actually stop and think about, theoretically, say Germany wins in the Soviet Union and then strikes at the United States, how that would be possible. Again, you're drifting into pure fantasy at this point. So that would be rather convenient that this has popped up. So, invade Great Britain. So this is laughable for a number of reasons. And for one of the reasons itself is that Germany in our timeline lost the Battle of Britain. And one of the two criteria for invasion of the British Isles was that Germany had control of the skies. So already you need to make Germany win the Battle of Britain, which again we're already drifting into alternate history immediately. But hypothetically speaking, say Germany wins the Battle of Britain. Germany did not have the logistics capability nor the naval capability to get an army across the Channel, and not only get it across the Channel but sustain that invasion. So we just need to think of this in how it actually happened in our timeline with D-Day. It required the two strongest navies on the planet to ensure D-Day was a success, and that is in the United States Navy and the Royal Navy, along with the Commonwealth and the remnants of like 3 French navies and stuff like that, to secure that beachhead on the Norman coast. Now, it required those two mainstream navies to ensure that was happening, and quite frankly, it was somewhat of a logistical miracle that it went as well as it did. Now, you're asking people to accept the idea that the Kriegsmarine, that were vastly underfunded, vastly fewer ships than the Royal Navy, let alone the Royal Navy and the American Navy collectively, along with overwhelming air support of the Allies at D-Day, you're asking that the Germans on their own would be capable of doing it. Because remember, unless you're saying that the Italian fleet somehow doesn't get slapped at Taranto and then is able to somehow take Gibraltar and then sail around and also aid with the English Channel, then again, you're drifting more and more into fantasy. And a similar thing to what I said in part 1 of this reaction video as well, the Germans didn't actually even have a blueprint or a design for landing craft. If a hypothetical invasion was to happen, it would have happened in little more than river barges or rowing boats, almost type idea. And that would have just been easy pickings for Allied aircraft, although let's say that Germans have control of the skies, then it'd still be easy pickings for land-based armaments and entrenchments. And, people think of Omaha, it's just like, well, imagine Omaha with rowing boats and wooden boats, it'd be a massacre. And that's not talking about the big elephant in the room as well, and that is the Royal Navy itself. Germany would, have to have control of the English Channel with the Kriegsmarine, which wasn't going to happen. Because, simply put, the Kriegsmarine did not have enough ships to sustain that coverage of the English Channel. And let's say hypothetically that the English Channel was vacant, and the Kriegsmarine was able to get a window of some hours that an invasion force would be unable to have landed. And simply, what would have happened was the Royal Navy would simply come around, rout or destroy the Kriegsmarine that's in the English Channel, and cut off the invasion army of the Germans, which would then be surrounded without supplies, without food, without ammunition, and ultimately either killed or captured. So much so that there were actually contingency plans that the British drew up, and they said in the event of a German invasion that the government would essentially be rerouted just a few miles north of London. That's how little they was worried about it. And again, this comments into the same vein that we see in our actual history as we know it, is that the fear of invasion was there, but it was never deemed to be a certain invasion, because while the Battle of Britain is going on and all of this, there's still British troops being kind of shipped out and deployed to other theatres of the war, particularly North Africa, while this so-called fear of invasion is happening. You know, that's how little necessarily that happened, that the North Africa campaign is still in full swing with the British pulling out manoeuvres and offensives. So if the British at the time in our own timeline weren't worried about naval invasion necessarily, I'm curious to see what mental gymnastics are needed to see how Germany can somehow invade Great Britain. And I think potential history is going to say more of the same with me.
This is the one that I see the most. Take the British out before you turn east. As if it was that simple. The Germans tried this. First by attempting to bomb the British into submission, which didn't work, and second by planning the invasion of the British home island in an operation named Sea Lion. This was going to be the amphibious assault that would take Britain out of the war, and plans were drawn up and early preparations were made. But before going through with it, the Germans themselves realized this wasn't going to work and cancelled it. The short answer for why is the Royal Navy and the inability of the Kriegsmarine and Luftwaffe to control the channel. The German Navy would be unable to keep the channel clear of British warships to enable troops and supplies to reach the British coast unless the Army's landing was on a very narrow front, resulting in less water needing to be covered. Knowing the coast was going to be heavily defended, the Army rejected this plan as they would need a wide landing front so they were not just feeding men into a meat grinder. In short, the Germans did not have the material to carry out a successful landing without it either bogging down and being cut off on the ground or being simply sunk on the way to its destination. In the 70s, the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst wargamed the scenario with conditions favorable to the Germans and came up with the operation being a total failure. Some commenters have gone as far as to suggest using paratroopers to take the British down, but I think you need to only look as far as Crete and Arnhem to see how badly an unsupported airborne operation can go. The Germans would still have to land by sea to resupply them and get relief troops on the ground, and the Royal Navy was too large an obstacle to allow this to happen, even by the Germans' own admission.
Yeah, and talking about that war game as well, when they actually war gamed it in the 70s, some of the things that they gave to the benefit of the Germans was that Germans had control of the skies and that weather was favourable. And despite both of those things happening, it came out with a colossal failure for the Germans in the invasion of the British Isles. So again, that is one thing that does make me laugh the most, is because it is possibly one of the most common examples of how Germany, the big what ifs if Germany could win the Second World War, and yet out of most of the examples, it seems to be one of the most flawed. But yeah, let's see what the next reason is. Oh, conclusion. Yeah.
One particular comment out of all of them really stood out to me. It began with, if the Nazis weren't Nazis, they would have won.
Yeah.
And I think this really speaks to the core of my point. Alternative history is fun. It makes for good hoi 4 games. But when really talking about it seriously, it's really hard to come by any academic conclusions outside of a few days of speculation, because you begin building assumption on assumption on assumption, and before you know it, you have changed the motivations and decision-making patterns of everybody you're talking about, and you are then just writing fan fiction.
This is your brain. This is your brain on alternative history.
Would Germany have won World War II if the Nazis weren't in power? Maybe, but it's also equally likely they wouldn't have started the war, or joined the Allies, or anything else. If there's no basis in reality to do with the people you are talking about in your assumption, what's the point? Germany decided to start a war that within a little over 2 years would see them taking on 3 superpowers at once, with the resources of most of the world behind them. Add in strategic mistakes and intelligence failures, it paints a very grim picture from the start, regardless of decisions made after the fact. Speaking of intelligence failures, don't let your private information go the way of the German armies. There are plenty of Alan Turings out there looking for information and private data that do not have the same honor and duty to country that the original did. If you're like me, you probably forget.
Okay, I'll just mute that because I think this is an advert going for the rest of it. But yeah, that's similar to what I've been saying this entire time as well, really, is alternate history is fun. It is really interesting to talk about. In fact, when I was at university, one of my projects was to discuss the kind of concept of making a television kind of show where you'd have, similar to Time Commanders, if anybody had seen that, where you have contestants who would take over, say, armies from notable historical battles or kind of the turning point battles in history and see how they would have fared with with the victors and see whether they would have won or whether they would have lost or whether they would have been able to win where history had failed. And then as part of that, so it'd be kind of a educational program aimed at military tactics and how they were used, where these men, these soldiers and stuff, these commanders would come from and how they would think about things. So it'd be more of a military history kind of program. And then once the battle was over, if, say, alternate history happened, say the contestants lost while they were controlling a party that won, or whether they won with a historical counterpart lost, then perhaps engage and maybe theorize what alternate paths history could have taken. You know, so for example, like let's say Carthage wins the Punic Wars. You know, would you speculate that then suddenly history doesn't become necessarily Roman-centric but North African-centric with the Carthaginians rising to the dominance of the Mediterranean area? Would they go on to make their own empire into Europe and stuff like that or not? And kind of speculate that. And it's fun to talk about those things. It's fun to debate and discuss and see where our minds take us with the past, because that's what makes the past so brilliant. However, if you're actually using it for proper, like, kind of academic, rigorous kind of idea making, then, as I've been saying throughout these last two videos, and as potential history summed up there as well, you can't do it, because the moment you start diverging from our actual timeline, then you're second guessing things, and then you're making assumptions based on assumptions. You're having characters who were this way in our timeline, you're making them act out of character, which means that they're no longer their actual personality anymore. They're a different personality together. And I think, as potential history summed up quite well, is it becomes fan fiction. And, you know, while it's fun to talk about, while it's fun to discuss, and you mentioned Hearts of Iron, I mean, I absolutely love Hearts of Iron as well. It's a really fun game. But, you know, anyone who's played that themselves understands how scuffed those games can be sometimes. And so, yeah, so while it's incredibly interesting and fun to talk about alternate history, you can't really base an argument on it, because it's alternate history. It didn't happen. You know, it's like arguing about wars that never fought, who won the battles in wars that never happened. So that's that. I as I said in the first part of this video, I strongly agree with potential history that Germany could not win the Second World War, or at least in the timeline that we know it. And as he said, if the Nazis weren't Nazis, or Hitler wasn't Hitler, then who says the Second World War happens anyway? So, as for our timeline, I strongly agree with potential history that Germany could not win the Second World War. And the only way that you can do that is if you make the Soviets not the Soviets, the Nazis not the Nazis, and even then, does that even lead to a second major global conflict that we now know as the Second World War? But who knows? So, as always, link will be in the description to the original video. Please head over there, like, support, subscribe to those guys. And of course, if you have any feedback or anything to share with me here, then please do. I want to make this as best as I possibly can, and I can only do that with your help. So thank you ever so much for watching. Apologies for the delay once again. Hopefully I should get to uploading more videos, and I hope you all have a nice day wherever you are. Stay safe. Thank you. Bye bye.